In the autumn of 1992, a construction crew widening a freeway south of San Diego cut into the earth and struck something they were never meant to find. What lay beneath that roadbed would ignite one of the most bitter arguments in the history of science. It asked a single unsettling question. What if everything we were taught about the first Americans is wrong? This is the story of 6 discoveries that refuse to stay buried in the timeline they may be about to shatter. For most of the last century, the story of the first Americans was simple, tidy, and almost universally accepted. The first people crossed a land bridge from Siberia into Alaska near the end of the last ice age, roughly 13,000 years ago. They carried a distinctive stone spear point, first found near Clovis, New Mexico, and so they were called the Clovis people. They were the first. That was the rule. To suggest anyone had come before them was, in the words of one archaeologist, tantamount to saying you had just seen Elvis walk out of a Burger King. Then came the freeway. In November of 1992, the state of California was expanding State Route 54 in San Diego County. A paleontologist named Richard Cerruti was monitoring the earth moving, watching for fossils, when the machinery exposed a scatter of broken bone. The site would be named after him, the Cerruti Mastodon Site. Over the next 5 months, a team from the San Diego Natural History Museum, led by paleontologist Thomas Demir, carefully excavated what was left of a single American mastodon, a heavy-limbed relative of the elephant that once roamed the continent. But this was not an ordinary bone bed. The mastodon's remains have been broken in a very particular way. Its limb bones were shattered while still fresh, snapped with the kind of spiral fractures you get when a heavy stone strikes living bone. 2 of its massive femur balls, the rounded ends of the thigh bones, lay side by side, one facing up and one facing down. And scattered among the fine sand were 5 large stones. Stones that did not belong in that soft sediment. Stones that showed wear and impact marks, as if they had been used as hammers and anvils to crack the bones open. To the team, it looked like a butchering site. Someone, or something, had processed this animal. Then came the number that changed everything. When geologists tested the bones using uranium and thorium, elements that decay at a known steady rate, the result was not 13,000 years. It was roughly 130,000 years. 100,000 years before the Clovis people, tens of thousands of years before our own species, Homo sapiens, is even thought to have left Africa. The researchers understood exactly how explosive this was. In their 2017 paper in the journal Nature, they did not claim these were modern humans. They could not. Instead, they wrote carefully that the site had been created by an unidentified species of Homo, some earlier member of the human family, perhaps a cousin we have not yet imagined walking the shores of North America. The reaction from the scientific community was swift and it was brutal. There is an old principle in science. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and to most archaeologists, a scatter of broken bones and rounded rocks did not come close. Critics pointed out something uncomfortable. The site was discovered by heavy construction equipment tearing through the ground. Could the machinery itself have cracked those ancient bones and driven those stones into the sediment? Others argued that the fracture patterns, the very patterns the team believed proved butchery, could be produced by entirely natural forces, by other animals, by the slow crush of sediment over 100,000 years. Thomas Deere never claimed to have all the answers. He admitted plainly that one site does not make a new paradigm. But he stood by the evidence and he asked the scientific community to do something difficult to keep an open mind to reconsider a story that had felt settled for generations. The Cerruti mastodon remains one of the most controversial claims in American archaeology. But here is what matters. It cracked the door open. Because once you allow yourself to ask whether the timeline is wrong, you start looking at other sites in a very different light. And some of those sites had been waiting, dismissed, and ignored for decades. Travel 3,000 tourists an hour north of that San Diego freeway into the frozen heart of the Yukon, and you reach a place called the Bluefish Caves. They are not grand. 3 small hollows in a limestone ridge, none larger than a modest room overlooking the Bluefish River about 54 kilometers southwest of a tiny community called Old Crow. This is the far northwest corner of Canada, a region that scientists call Bingia. During the last ice age, when so much of the planet's water was locked up in glaciers, the sea level dropped and Bingia became a vast, cold, grassy land bridgeage connecting Asia to the Americas. If people came to the New World on foot, they came through here. Between 1977 and 1987, an archaeologist named Jacques Cinq-Mars excavated these caves, and what he found astonished him. Among tens of thousands of animal bones from horses, caribou, and mammoths, he believed he saw the marks of human hands, cut marks, butchery, and when he dated the bones, some of them reached back as far as 30,000 years. He said so publicly, and for that, he was punished because in the 1980s, the Clovis first model was iron law. To claim a site twice as old as Clovis in a place with few stone tools and no obvious hearth was to invite ridicule. St. Mars watched his findings dismissed for decades. His work was treated as a cautionary tale rather than a discovery. He grew bitter, convinced that the scientific establishment had refused to even look at his evidence. And then, long after most people had stopped paying attention, the evidence was looked at again. A young French archaeologist named Laurien Bourgeon returned to that old collection of bones, now stored away in boxes, and examined it with modern eyes and modern tools. She studied more than 30,000 bone fragments, and on the jawbone of an ancient Yukon horse, she found something unmistakable. A series of straight, clean, parallel cuts, exactly where a stone blade would slice to remove the animal's tongue. These were not the ragged marks of a wolf's teeth or the scrape of a trampling hoof. They were the work of a tool held in a human hand. When those bones were radiocarbon, dated at a laboratory in Oxford, the results published in 2017 confirmed the impossible. Humans had been butchering horses in these caves as far back as 24,000 years ago. Suddenly, Bluefish Caves was the oldest known archaeological site in North America, pushing the human story back nearly 10,000 years in a single stroke, and quietly vindicating a man who had been mocked for most of his career. It fit beautifully with a new idea called the Bingian standstill, the theory that a small population became stranded in that land bridge for thousands of years, waiting as walls of ice blocked the path south before finally pouring into the continent when the world warmed. Even now, the Bluefish claim is not fully settled. Skeptics note that the caves held no clear living floor, no charcoal from ancient fires, and that the exact relationship between the dated bones and the human marks can be difficult to pin down. Jacques Cinq-Mars died in 2021, still waiting for full acceptance, but the tide had turned. The wall of certainty was cracking, and the next crack would come from a cave perched high in the mountains of Mexico. High in the arid mountains of northern Zacatecas in Mexico, there is a cave so remote and so difficult to reach that almost no one would go there without a reason. It is called Xiqui. It sits nearly 3,000 miles above sea level, a dark chamber tucked beneath a limestone cliff. And in 2020, it produced a claim that made headlines around the world. An archaeologist named Cyprien Ardelon had been digging inside Xiqui Cave for years. Deep in its floor, sealed beneath layers of hardened mud and rubble, his team recovered nearly 2,000 pieces of broken limestone. To Ardelian, these were not random rocks. They were tools, flakes, blades, points, and cores shaped by human hands. And the layers that held them were old, very old. When his team published their findings in the journal Nature, the dates were staggering. The oldest layers reached back 31 to 33,000 years. The clearest evidence of occupation clustered around 26,500 years ago. If Ardelin was right, humans had been sheltering in this high mountain cave more than 10,000 years before the Clovis people, during the very coldest, harshest depth of the last ice age. There was just one problem, and it was a serious one. The cave contained no human bones, no human DNA, no hearths that could be firmly tied to people. The entire case rested on the stones themselves, and whether those stones were tools or simply rocks became the heart of a furious debate. In 2021, a team of respected archaeologists led by Jim Chatters and Ben Potter published a blistering response. They introduced a word that haunts every one of these ancient sites, geoax. A geoact is a stone that looks like a tool but was never touched by a human. It is broken and flaked by nature alone, by roof fall inside a cave, by rocks tumbling down a cliff face, by the slow grinding movement of debris across thousands of years. Chatters and his colleagues argued that Xiqui Eat Cave sat in exactly the kind of place where nature manufactures fakes beneath a cliff prone to rockfall, filled with sliding debris. They pointed out that the so-called tools showed no consistent patterned flaking, the signature of deliberate human craft. And they raised a deeper objection. If people were truly in this Mexican cave 26,000 years ago, it would mean humans were in the Americas before the genetic split that separates Native Americans from their East Asian ancestors even occurred. The whole family tree would have to be redrawn. Critically, Chatters and his team never actually held the stones in their hands. They worked from the published photographs and data, and Ardelian fired back. He defended his site fiercely, publishing a detailed reply, personally analyzing 10 of the strongest tools, pointing to signs of use, wear, and intentional shaping. He remained convinced that more than 200 of the objects locked in the deepest sealed layer of mud had been dated correctly and could not be explained away. So who is right? The honest answer even today is that we do not know for certain. Xiqui Cave sits in a kind of scientific limbo, too well demented to ignore, too thin on hard proof to command belief, but the pattern is becoming impossible to miss. Again and again, someone finds broken stone in ancient earth. Again and again, the argument comes down to the same haunting question. Did a human make this, or did the earth only make it look that way? And nowhere is that question sharper than at a quarry along a river in South Carolina. Along the banks of the Savannah River in Allentown County, South Carolina, there's a place where the earth is rich with stone. For thousands of years, ancient people came here to harvest a hard, flint-like rock perfect for making sharp tools. The site is called Topper, named for a local forester, who first led archaeologists to it in 1981. The man who would make Topper famous and infamous was an archaeologist named Albert Goodyear. When he began serious excavations in 1986, Topper was a good, solid, respectable site. By the late 1990s, his team had documented a clear Clovis presence, making it one of the most important early sites in the American Southeast. Goodyear himself was a believer in the standard story. As he later admitted, he did not expect to find anything older than Clovis, and he saw little reason to dig deeper. Then, in 1998, he decided to break the rule. He dug below the Clovis layer, the floor that most archaeologists treated as the bottom of human history in America. And he did not hit empty, sterile ground. He found stone tools, small scrapers, blades, and flakes in soil that dated to around 16,000 years, thousands of years before Clovis. That alone was enough to make him a controversial figure. But Goodyear was not finished. In 2004, acting on what he called a hunch, he pushed nearly 4 meters deeper into the ancient place terrace. There, buried in the sand, he found more chipped stone, and alongside it, a dark stain in the soil. The carbonized remains of ancient burn plants. When that charcoal was sent for radiocarbon dating, 2 results came back that stunned him. Roughly 50,000 years and older, still past 51,000. 50,000 years in South Carolina, long before the last ice age reached its peak. If the stones beside that charcoal were tools, then humans had walked this riverbank an astonishing 37,000 years before Clovis. Goodyear had his stars, a large chunk of worked CH he affectionately nicknamed Big Red, which he believed showed clear repeated strikes from human hands. But the criticism was immediate, and it was well aimed. And this time, the doubt lived in the very method of dating. 50,000 years is right at the outer edge of what radiocarbon dating can even measure. Beyond that limit, a sample is effectively radiocarbon dead, and the reading becomes deeply unreliable. Critics argued the dark stain might not be a campfire at all, but the residue of a natural wildfire. And the stones once again drew the same verdict from skeptics like Michael Waters and Michael Collins. Natural fractures, geofacts. One critic noted that the deep tools looked nearly identical across an enormous span of time, unchanged from 50,000 years to 15,000 years ago, which is not how real human tool making behaves. Real technology evolves. These did not. Goodyear held his ground for the rest of his career, and he was not entirely alone. A later doctoral study argued that at least some of the Topper stones showed microscopic traces of genuine use, polish, and wear, consistent with tools that had actually done work. But the mainstream never accepted the 50,000-year date. Topper became something stranger than proven or disproven. It became a permanent question mark planted deep in the American earth. And it sets the stage for 2 sites so extreme that they push us out of the realm of debate and into the realm of the almost unbelievable. To understand this next story, you have to understand the man at the center of it, because he was not a crank. He was one of the most celebrated scientists of the 20th century. His name was Louis Leakey. Along with his wife Mary, Leakey had transformed our understanding of human origins in Africa, unearthing fossils that pushed the human story back millions of years and helped prove that humanity was born on the African continent. When Louis Leakey spoke about ancient humans, the world listened. In 1959, an archaeologist from California named Ruth Diet Simpson brought Leakey some curious stones. They came from the Mojave Desert near Barstow, from a place in the Calico Hills. To Simpson, they looked like scrapers, ancient tools. And Leakey was intrigued for a reason, all his own. He was convinced that the sheer number and variety of native languages across the Americas could not possibly have developed in a mere 12,000 years. It felt too fast. He believed people had been here far, far longer, and that no one had simply dug deep enough to prove it. In 1963, with funding from the National Geographic Society, Leakey launched excavations at what became the Calico Early Man Site. It would be the only site in the New World he ever worked on. And for the rest of his life, he defended it. His team recovered thousands of broken stones they interpreted as tools. And in 1980, using uranium and thorium dating, geologists put an age on the deposits. Roughly 200,000 years. Not 200 years, not 20,000, 200,000 years. A number so enormous it would place tool-making humans in California before our own species had fully emerged anywhere on Earth. One researcher connected to the site would go even further, suggesting the stones might be 500,000 years old. The scientific community recoiled, and the objection was by now familiar. No human remains were ever found at Calico. Not a single bone. The geologist Vance Haynes visited the site and delivered a devastating verdict. The stones, he said, were geoacs fractured by the violent tumbling of an ancient river and debris flow that had once torn through the Calico Hills. Nature, he argued, had forged these tools, not people. The most painful blow of all came from within Leakey's own family. His wife Mary, a brilliant scientist in her own right, did not share his faith in Calico. She wrote with real anguish that his involvement with the site had cost her some of her academic respect for him. She called the Calico excavations catastrophic to his professional reputation. And yet, Louis Leakey never let go. He kept visiting the site several times a year, defending it until his death in 1972. So, what was Calico? Was it evidence of a lost human timeline, a chapter erased from every textbook? Or was it the great blind spot of a great man who wanted so badly to find deep human roots in America that he saw tools where there were only rocks? To this day, the vast majority of scientists say the stones are natural. But Calico endures as one of archaeology's most haunting stories. A reminder that even genius can fall in love with an idea. And Calico is not even the most extreme claim on this list. That title belongs somewhere else. It belongs in Mexico. In the highlands of central Mexico, in the Viquedo Basin near the city of Puebla, lies a site whose dates are so staggering that they make everything before them seem almost cautious. Its name is Huayatlaco, and more than 60 years after it was found, it remains perhaps the single most contested archaeological site in all the Americas. The story begins in the early 1960s. A Mexican scholar named Juan Armenta Camacho, who had grown up in the region, and a young Harvard-trained archaeologist named Cynthia Irwin Williams, began excavating a landscape littered with the fossilized bones of Ice Age. Giants, mammoths, mastodons, camels, direwolves, ground sloths. It looked like a kill site, a place where ancient hunters had brought down and butchered enormous prey. And the tools they found were not crude. Among the simpler implements were sophisticated pieces, finely flaked double-edged blades, elegant projectile points, some made from stone that had been carried in from far away. These were the works of skilled, experienced toolmakers embedded in the earth, right alongside the bones of extinct animals. The trouble, as always, was the age, and here the trouble became almost overwhelming because the site had no good carbon to test. So, a young geologist named Virginia Steen McIntyre was brought in, an expert in dating volcanic ash layers. Working with colleagues, she applied not one, but several independent methods to the ash and sediment that held the tools, uranium series dating, fish and track dating. And the numbers that came back did not just push the timeline, they demolished it. The dates centered around 260,000 years. One method reached even further, suggesting an age of 370,000 years. These were not numbers anyone was prepared to accept. They would place skilled toolmakers in Mexico thousands of years before modern humans are believed to have existed in a continent that supposedly had no people at all until 13,000 years ago. What happened next became a legend in its own right. The lead archaeologist, Cynthia Irwin Williams, was horrified by the extreme dates and publicly called them irresponsible. The geologists who produced them stood firm. Virginia Steen McIntyre found that defending the data came at a terrible cost. She has said that speaking up about Laco damaged her career, that the results were buried, and that the scientific establishment simply refused to grapple with what the dating showed. To this day, her supporters describe Huayatlaco as a case of suppression of evidence too dangerous to publish. Skeptics offer a calmer explanation. The dating methods of the 1960s and 70s were young and imperfect. Rework sediment, in which ancient volcanic material gets mixed with younger layers, can produce wildly inflated ages. There are no confirmed sites anywhere else in the Americas remotely this old, and no fossils of the ancient humans who would have made these tools. The dates, they argue, are not a conspiracy. They are simply wrong. And yet, the tools are real. No one disputes that human hands shaped those beautiful blades and points. No one disputes that they were found among the bones of Ice Age beasts. The only question, the same question that has followed us through every one of these sites, is when Huayatlaco has never been solved. It sits in the record like a locked door, and no one has ever found the key. So where does this leave us? 6 sites, a San Diego freeway, a frozen Yukon cave, a mountaintop in Mexico, a river quarry in South Carolina, a desert in California, a basin of Ice Age bones. 6 times someone stood over broken stone and ancient earth and dared to say, "We were here far earlier than you think." And 6 times the scientific world answered with doubt, with skepticism, and with that unforgiving word, geofacts. It would be easy to walk away believing this is all fantasy, that every one of these claims is a mistake or a hoax or a great man's obsession, but that would be the wrong lesson. Because while the archaeologists were arguing, the ground itself kept talking. And in a dried lake bed in White Sands, New Mexico, it finally said something no one could explain away. There, preserved in ancient mud, researchers found footprints, Not tools that might be natural, not bones that might have been broken by machines. Human footprints. The prints of adults and children walking along the shore of a vanished lake. One of them tracking a giant ground sloth across the flats. You cannot argue that a footprint is a geofact. A footprint is a person, a moment, a life. And when those footprints were dated, first by seeds, then by pollen, then by grains of quartz, and finally by mud tested in 2 separate laboratories, every method agreed. They were between 21,000 and 23,000 years old, thousands of years before the Clovis people. Made during the frozen peak of the last ice age, when the textbooks insisted the Americas were empty. That is the quiet triumph hidden inside all this controversy. The wild claims from San Diego and the Yukon and Mexico may never all be proven. Some are probably wrong. But taken together, they did something important. They forced open a door that had been nailed shut. They made room for the truth that eventually walked through it. The first Americans were here far, far longer than we were ever taught. And that is the real gift of these strange, disputed sites. They remind us that the human story is not finished. That certainty is often just a question no one has thought to ask yet. Somewhere out there under a highway, beneath a riverbank, sealed in the floor of a cave, the next footprint is waiting. And the people who left it are still calling to us across the deep silence of time, asking only to be remembered,